Hello and welcome to this, the next and in fact the penultimate of our Christmas talks from Grace Church, Sheffield, about how the coming of Jesus to earth is predicted in the writings of the prophet Isaiah. You see, even though Isaiah lived hundreds of years before Jesus, God showed him what he was going to do when Jesus came all those years later. Now, one of the silliest statements people make, especially over the internet, is when they compare belief in Jesus or God to belief in Santa Claus. They'll say things like, "Oh, I don't believe in Jesus any more than I believe in Santa Claus." Or they say, "Well, I don't have to have an imaginary sky friend to help me." So they think that they're being clever. Now, the problem is they don't realise how ridiculous it sounds, because Santa Claus is, of course, purely legend, and we know that sky friends are non-existent. Interestingly, when in 1961 Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man ever to go in space, the official atheist Soviet propaganda machine announced that Gagarin had said, "I went up into space, but I didn't encounter God." But of course we later found out that was a complete lie, because Gagarin was in fact a Christian, a firm believer who never gave up his faith. But his belief in God was not about belief in a sky friend that you could find somewhere in space, but in the mighty God who made heaven and earth. And similarly, faith in Jesus is not about some belief in some legendary person who never existed or might have just existed far back in history and the legends have grown about him, say like Santa Claus or Robin Hood. But it's about a knowledge about a character of history. In fact, we know just as much, if not more, about Jesus than most other characters of ancient history, whose existence we accept without question. For example, we probably know more about Jesus than we do about his contemporary, the Emperor Tiberius. Yet no one doubts Tiberius's existence. But having established that Jesus existed, how do we know that he was the Son of God and that the claims he made about for himself are true? When John the Baptist had been put in prison, he was hearing all about Jesus was doing, and he was having doubts as to whether Jesus was the actual Messiah of Israel, because Jesus seemed quite unlike the sort of Messiah he was expecting. You see, John was expecting a Messiah to come with fire and brimstone, but Jesus was this gentle person who was healing the sick and whatever. And so John sent some of his disciples to Jesus and asked him, "Are you the one who we have been expecting as Messiah, or should we look for somebody else?" Now it says when Jesus got that message, he didn't respond with an argument. He actually did something. Jesus, you see, knew that John would have the Jewish scriptures in his head, and especially the prophecy of Isaiah. And there's a verse in chapter 25 of Isaiah, in verses 5 to 6, which reads, "And when he, the Messiah, comes, he will open the eyes of the blind and unplug the ears of the deaf. The lame will leap like a deer, and those who cannot speak will sing for joy." So what did Jesus do? Luke tells us in his gospel, at that same time, Jesus cured many people of their diseases, illnesses, and evil spirits, and he restored sight to many who were blind. And then he told John's disciples, "Go back to John and tell him what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." In other words, Jesus was telling John that he was doing all the miraculous things that Isaiah had prophesied that the Messiah would do in establishing the kingdom of God on earth. Then Jesus adds the words of encouragement. God blesses those who do not fall away because of me. Jesus was encouraging John to remain faithful and believing, even though he was not the sort of Messiah that John had been expecting, or the kingdom he was building was not the violent blood and fire kingdom that John thought he was prophesying about originally. You know, people do have a problem with Jesus because he's not what people expect. And we've become so familiar with the Christmas stories, but we cover them in sentimentality. And we do not realise that the people involved are flesh and blood people that today would have been classed almost as refugees fleeing for their lives from a despotic ruler. And we've so romanticised the stable and the manger in, paintings on Christmas cards that we forget it was the rather unsanitary, drafty ground floor of a lodging house where the animals were stashed, and the manger was in fact probably a rather dirty animal's feeding trough. But the more we look at them, the more we realise that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, even though it was not in the way people expected. We realise that a kingdom was being built by Jesus, which went against all the principles that this world's kingdoms were built upon. Where might was not right, the first should be last, and the meek would inherit the earth in this new kingdom. But in all, that kingdom, you see, is still expanding on earth, because we know that Jesus is alive and that he's still working today to change lives and heal people, just like he did when he was on earth. Well, somebody might say, well, how do we know this? That the world around us seems to be a pretty bad place. Well, first of all, there is the witness of prophecy. The great prophets of the Old Testament all spoke about the Messiah who was coming. Isaiah especially speaks in great detail hundreds of years before the event of what Jesus' ministry would be like, and we've taken a few examples in these talks. And Isaiah even predicts great details, like the fact that Jesus' death would be among wicked people. He was crucified with the wicked, but his grave would be provided by a rich man. Joseph of Arimathea provided a grave for Jesus. You see, the fact that so many prophecies are fulfilled in such detail speaks about the authenticity, not just of the Gospels, but of the life of Jesus itself. Secondly, there is the witness of history. As I've said, we know that Jesus was a real person, and anyone who says differently is just, frankly, thoroughly ignorant. There's a multitude of manuscripts and witnesses to his life and ministry, far more than any contemporary ancient person whose existence we take for granted. And thirdly, there's the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Well, there's no time to talk about it here. I've done some Easter talks about it, which you can look up online. But except to say that careful study reveals that the evidence for the resurrection is very strong indeed. And fourthly, there is the fact that Jesus still changes lives today and still does miracles in the world. I mean, we still see people healed today, and we still see lives changed by the power of God, just like happened 2,000 years ago. Jesus is still building his kingdom today, just like he did then, and people whose lives are hopeless are being given new hope all over the world. They are being given hope and forgiveness by the power of God. You see, as Christians, our faith is not blind faith as some people would like to make out, but it's built on solid facts, on history, on what we see. You know, belief in Father Christmas brought me joy when I was a little child, but I soon realised it was a myth, and it was my parents who actually brought me the presents. But as an educated adult, and I've been educated, I've got 2 degrees, one in physics, one in theology to master's level. But as an educated adult, and I'm in my 78th year now, my faith in Jesus brings me joy. And I know it's based not on myths, but it's based on solid facts.